Good evening, everybody. We're continuing our path, the path of the just, finding our own path of spirituality, of closeness to Hashem. We're in the section of the book which is known as Precious, which is the higher level, which basically means separation, separating yourself from things which are permitted, making an extra line of demarcation. And as we discussed last week, there's two kinds of separation. There's a desirable kind of preshut separation, and there's a kind of preshut which is not desirable, which is dangerous, and a person should be careful not to go down that road. But before we get there, let's first of all talk about the desirable kind of separation. The Mesilas Yesharim identified three specific areas last week we spoke about. One was eating and drinking. Wine, as we know, can lead to licentiousness. Eating leads to a person to feeling satiated and sluggish when it comes to his avodas Hashem. If a person demands that his table is filled with sushi and steak every day of the week, then he may have to force himself to go and make money that he doesn't really need to put himself in all kinds of situations. If he demands a standard of living which is beyond which Hashem is sending him naturally, so that's another kind of evil. He's going to thrust himself into the heat of the race for possessions and property, and that'll lead to other things, like he'll travel down the roads where he'll start taking oaths about repaying money, false oaths. That was one of the areas that a person has to be careful. And as we know, the Torah describes a situation of a sota, a woman who is being accused by her husband of sequestering herself, of being immoral with someone else. And the Torah says a person who sees a sota bekil kula, the destruction of the sota, if she turns out to be guilty, should go and also himself prohibit himself from drinking wine, which of course wine is a permitted thing in the correct context. But anybody who sees this, the sota, should realize and understand and deduce that from where that eventual falling down in her particular case came from, that it came from wine, and take an oath of abstinence for a specific period of time. That was one area of separation. Another area of separation we talked about was marital relations. Of course, marital relations are not only permitted between husband and wife, but also there's a mitzvah on Shabbos. Nevertheless, a person, if he indulges himself even in that which is mutter, can find himself drawn, because the general principle is the nature of the body is that the more you give the body, the more it becomes hungry. In fact, he speaks about this specifically in the context of marital relations, as Chazal teaches us in Sukkah. It says, "Eva cotton yesh ba'odam." Man, there is a small organ in a person. Masbi'oi, if you satisfy it, ra'ev, it's hungry. Marvi'oi, mar'ivoi, but if you starve it, sovea, it's satisfied. The nature of physicality is that the more you get, the more you want. That was the second area. The third area we spoke about was clothing, adornments, even though, of course, it's permitted. Anything that does not have a mitzvah of shatnez, forbidden prohibition of linen and wool, is mutter. The person can buy whatever he wants, wear whatever he wants. But there's a tendency when a person who starts to buy very expensive, fashionable clothing, that he preens himself, he looks at himself, he becomes very self-aware, and that already is, even though in essence there's nothing wrong with that, me'ika hadin, but it leads him away from Hashem. It leads him to conceit, to gaiva, to all kinds of other things, other bad things. As we quoted from Bereshis Rabbah, Chazal say, "Kivan sheroya hayetza odom shetola ba'akevov." Once the Yetzer Hara sees somebody that is kind of, posing, twisting on his heels. And mamash begodov, he's feeling his clothes, he's adjusting his clothing, and he's preening in the mirror. Umasalsel basaro, and he's twirling his hair. Omer, the Reitzah Sarah says, Zesheli, this one's mine. What we didn't speak about last week was, maybe actually we did, the next area he talked about was tiulim, going for trips and journeys. Of course, everybody needs a holiday. The thing is, though, when a person has to be careful, because the nature of wanting to take it easy, when you need to take it easy, leads to want to take it easy when you shouldn't be taking it easy. So that's one area that a person has to be careful. Another area of a person has to be careful is speech itself. Provided a person doesn't speak with things which are osa, nivel peh, lashon hara. But nevertheless, the nature of speech is that because it is very flexible, if a person isn't actually channeling his speech and actively thinking about what he's saying, if he's not involved in tefillah, if he's not involved in learning Torah, if he's not involved in when he's speaking to some other person to try and see a way to encourage that person or think about speech in a very proactive and constructive way, he'll get himself into tittle-tattle, chatter, and apart from bittul zman, which of course is for sure a big problem when you're speaking, shooting the breeze, as they say, but it leads to all kinds of averos. It leads very easily to scoffing, to leitzonos, to lashon hara, to speaking evil about people. So a person has to be very careful when he opens his mouth and he uses that tremendously powerful facility, unique to man. Man is known as the hamadaber, the speaker. Man is the one who speaks. That's the distinguishing characteristic of a human being, is his ability to speak. So that power, and it's a power, a godly power, vayadaber Hashem el Moshe. We see that Hashem, Kaviyochel, speaks as well. But so that's a godly power, but it has to be something which is extremely carefully used, because, as I say, it can run in the wrong direction. Okay. So in general, he says, everything connected with this world has a great danger in it, because the nature of chumrius, the nature of physicality, the nature of everything connected to this world is basically to pull a person down. That's the Adama. A person is Adam, his name is Adam because part of him is from the Adama. And just as the earth sinks down, so the whole idea of physicality is that which by its nature will tend to make a person more connected to this world. Of course, a man is a combination. He's a bifurcation of a spiritual being and an animal being. But the nature of indulging, it doesn't mean to say indulging in the sort of like gross indulgence, but the mere involvement. And of course, a person has to be involved in this world. There's no doubt about it. Everybody has to drink, everybody has to eat, everybody has to have a certain degree of olam hazeh. We're living in this world. But the whole point of Precious is to be very well aware that everything in this world has a tendency to make a person more worldly, further away from spirituality, and therefore, as much as he can, and that's really his point here, is to limit his involvement with olam hazeh. And we're going to see this to actually what he needs. How do you know what you need? Of course, a person is noagea klape atzma. A person is, biased when it comes to himself. A person very easily confuses his wants with his needs. When a person says, I need this, all of the time what he means is, I want this. And of course, that's why Chazal teaches, Aseh lecha rav, kaneh lecha chaver. Make yourself a rabbi and acquire yourself a friend. Your friend and your rav, all the more so, do not have your yetzaharas. They do not have they're not self-interested. They couldn't care less whether you're going to buy this suit or some other suit. Your friend doesn't really matter. Care if you're going to go on this holiday or that holiday or whatever you're going to order for your evening meal. But he And therefore he's in a position to be objective and to understand you. And if he's a good friend, will say, yeah, something, I think you need that, or do you really need that? So the whole idea of precious is to take the absolute minimum that a person needs from this world, the minimum that he needs to survive, more than survive, to be able to serve Hashem. And of course, it's a fine line. A person, as I said before, has the tendency to mistake his needs and his wants. But for sure, anything that leads a person to depression, if he's doing this particular thing, if he's neglecting this particular part of his personality, is a cause for concern. And one of the problems that can happen when people become religious is that they try to do a kind of frontal lobotomy on their personalities, and end up very unhappy and end up rejecting all of their spiritual growth and going back to where they were before. So it's not only counterproductive, but it's a dangerous thing. A person has to move incrementally and understand exactly what he needs, as I say, with the consultation of his peers and his advisors. But anything that he sees clearly is making him depressed. And I'm not talking about, let's say a person's a thief and it makes him depressed because he can't steal anymore. I'm not talking about that, obviously. I'm sorry, you'll have to be depressed. I'm talking about things which are mutter, things which are permissible, things which the Torah allows us to do. And a person, because he wants to be on a higher level, and he fools himself that he can achieve this, and he ends up feeling miserable, for sure, that is a mistaken kind of precious. I'll put this in now. I think I was going to say it later on, but I think, obviously, precious is something, as he's going to say, is not for everybody. But if a person wants to and feels, and it could be that a person who is able to do this is responsible to do this and obliged to do this. If a person feels he wants to have this greater closeness with Hashem, that's going to really, of course, that's what Hashem wants, is ultimately is for us to be close to Him. And the more porish a person is, the more spiritual he is, the more involved he is in ruchnis, spirituality and Torah, so the closer he is to Hashem by definition. But if a person wants to move up this ladder in some way, he doesn't have to become a tzaddik, a chosid. He doesn't have to become a porish in every single area of his life. Usually, when it comes to these kinds of things, I think I'm right in saying that a person should choose something that he already feels good about, that he enjoys doing anyway, and be mahader, how do you say it in English? Not beautify. Beautify is not really a word I would use. You're right, it can mean that, but like you can embellish that, make it more, take that particular area of his life. Let's say, for example, a person likes davening. Now, some people like davening, some people hate davening. Everybody has to daven, but some people enjoy davening. So he can maybe add things. I'm just giving you an example off the top of my head, add things to davening that people don't normally say. Now, it's a mitzvah to say the korbanos in the morning. I don't know how many people do. But for sure, if a person wants to be mahadeh in davening, he should say Eza Makoiman, the Mishnahs that we learn. Another example, there are 6 remembrances that we say every day. You could say every day. After davening, 6 constant things that a person should be thinking of. Yitzias Mitzrayim, Ma'amad HaSinai, Amalek, the golden calf, Miriam speaking Lashon Hara about Moshe Rabbeinu, and Zochas HaShabbos HaKadosh. 6 places where the Torah mentions the word Zocha. It's a conversation in itself, why particularly those 6 things. But for example, that's something which is in every prayer book after Shachris. If you want to be Mahadeh, if you feel you want to do something a bit more where it comes to Tefillah, that's something you could do. But again, I feel that the success that a person has in these areas will work if he chooses areas where he already feels comfortable and happy with those areas. Not areas that he finds getting to, how do you say, Shlav Aleph, square, first base, right, in American parlance. If he's already finding getting to first base hard, if he's the kind of guy that kind of, hits his alarm clock several times fairly violently and manages to make the last minion in Dushinsky or whatever, then it's not the sort of person who should start thinking about Mehadar and Tefillah. There are other areas, I'm sure, which he could find, where he enjoys his avodas Hashem or whatever it is that he could be Mehadar. Okay, so the next thing we're going to. Right, so now, this is the next question we've come on to. Questions up there, we're okay?
Yeah, actually. So, in that case, what should be the end goal to someone's spiritual growth, right? If you're saying, not everyone has to strive to become, chassid or anything, what should one strive to become? Or, what's a point where they can say, they get to a point and they say, okay, I'm good,
That point never arrives. A person should all of his life be growing as much as he can, because the nature of life is to basically for a person to go down unless it's a bit like the escalator. If you stand still on the escalator, you'll go down. If you walk, you'll stand still. The only way to move up is to run. So for sure, everybody on their level should be doing more and more. I mean, on their level. We're talking about levels which are above, but for sure, if a person can do it, he should do it. Now, maybe this is actually what you're asking. As this is really what you're saying. He says here, "Ve'im toshal v'toima." If you'll ask me and say, "V'im kein eifos shezeh dava hamitztorich umuchrach lama lo gozru alav hachamim kamo shegozru al siogos tekonos shegozru." If we're saying that the true elevation of a person required, that the precious is something which is not more than desirable, which is required from a person, then why didn't Chazal make that like the rest of the Shulchan Aruch? You have to do this. This is what you have to do. Why didn't they do that? The answer is that Chazal never make a gezerah she'ein ha-tzibor yochol la'amod boi, that the community is not going to be able to keep, to stand by, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's counterproductive, and second of all, it calls the whole authority of Chazal into question. Back in the day, when tobacco smoking at one point was considered to be healthy, not so long ago, about 100 years ago maybe, people thought that tobacco was healthy, it helped the digestion, v'chule, v'chule. Then medical research proved overwhelmingly that it was not only damaging, but extremely damaging and life-threatening. And they went to, I think it was to Moshe Feinstein's itself. I guess this must be in the 50s or 40s even. And they said, that they should make a gezerah, the Rav should make a gezerah, the Rav should make a gezerah that smoking should be an Issa D'Rabbanan. I mean, it's nishmata misnafsho sechem. You have to, Torah says, ma'od, you have to guard your life extremely, with tremendous care and not do anything which is going to be life-threatening in any way. It's an Issa D'Oraisa. Certainly it's a bittul asay. So he wouldn't do it. He would not make tobacco smoking, cigarettes, osa, or cigars for that matter, for this reason, because most people will not be able to do that. He said, if I'm not mistaken, that it's osa for a person who doesn't smoke to take it up. But for a person who is already, and certainly when it comes to nicotine, addicted, and a lot of us, in maybe using the word in inverted commas, in quotation marks, are addicted to behaviors which maybe are not life-threatening like this, but it would be very, very hard, by virtue of who we are, to give them up. So Chazal didn't, and the poskim of nowadays are not going to come along and make gezeiras about things which they know people are not going to be able to take on. But, as he says, the select few who desire to achieve a greater closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then they should certainly do this. And he says an interesting lashon here. special people in the people, hachafetzim niskois, li krovosa yisborach, to merit this closeness to Hashem, ulezakos biz chusam, lachol sha'hahamon, and very interesting, to benefit everybody else in the community. The Hasidim amongst us don't just benefit themselves for sure, but they have an effect on the whole community of raising the whole community up. There's a famous medrash which talks about the Lulav and the Esrog and the Arba Minim, and it compares the 4 minim to 4 kinds of Jews. Very well known medrash. The Esrog, starting at the top, has both taste and smell. The Esrog tastes good, you can make it into food, and it has a beautiful smell to it. So the Esrog is compared to a Jew who has both Torah and mitzvahs. Torah, the beautiful smell are his maisim tovim, or his good actions, and his taste is the tam Torah, that he has Torah as well. Now you have the lulav. The lulav gives forth very tasty fruit. He has Torah, but it has no odor, no aroma. It doesn't have a particularly pleasant or attractive smell. So that's a Jew who has Torah, but he doesn't have maisim tovim. I'm not saying he's a Rasha Chaleila, but he's not exemplary in that area. And on the other hand, you have a hadas, a myrtle, which smells beautiful, somebody who has very good, let's say, midot, character traits, but he doesn't learn. He's an Am Haaretz, maybe. And there's a 4th category, the Arava, the willow. Now the willow neither has tam nor reich, it neither has Torah, nor does he have any Torah. So it says, Yavoi Eile v'yechapru al Eile. These, the other kinds of Jews, should come along and they will be a kapara for the Arava, basically, who has no mitzvahs and no ma'asim tovim. The mere fact that you have people who are b'nei aliyah in every generation, who are working on themselves, who are trying to strive, brings the entire community up. Now, obviously, it brings the whole entire community up, first of all, because people see and are impacted, impressed, inspired. But there's also a more mystical thing that carries on. When people are doing what they should be doing, so to speak, it has an influence in the entire world. Now, the Nefesh HaChaim goes into this in great detail, how basically HaKadosh Baruch Hu committed himself, so to speak, to run the entire world based on the actions, the thoughts, and the words of the Jewish people. And what we do, our actions, is really connected to this, not just internally amongst the Jewish people, but has a hashpah, has an influence in the entire world. When you keep Shabbos, or some of you, or you put on your tefillin in the morning, it's not just that the tefillin, even though you don't feel this, is suffusing you with this supernal glow, which of course is invisible and you don't even see it, but it's there. But this mitzvah, this Ma'aseh mitzvah, travels up through all the olamot, all the worlds above this world, up to the very highest points of existence. And it there reaches, so to speak, the control room of the universe, right? And in the control room of the universe, so to speak, this energy that you sent up is translated into something which descends back down, all down through those worlds, cascades all the way down through all of the worlds above this world, the myriad of worlds, and ends up in this world as a hashpah of tov, of good. Meaning, for example, let's say there was a typhoon that was ordered up in the China Sea, that gets cancelled. Or in Namibia, there's abundant rainfall after 4 years of drought. Because why? Because you put on your tefillin. So we see that this is, of course, all of us, not just Hasidim. The Ma'aseh mitzvah, when a Jew does a mitzvah, says the Nefesh HaChaim, this has this ripple effect that goes all the way up and comes all the way down again as bracha, and Chas v'Chalil, the reverse is also true. So, by the way, I'll just mention I made a video about this, which I titled "The Jews Run the World," which is basically what I said. But of course, it was misappropriated, and I got banned from YouTube. YouTube gave me a strike, and they made me take this educational course to understand what is considered hate speech. Okay, I mean, I agree the title was provocative, but as far as I can say, the title should be provocative because there's so much stuff going on out there unless you provoke somebody to actually watch what you're putting. But what I said was basically that. And of course, you can disagree with that. I don't expect everybody to agree with this principle. I'm a believing Jew, ani ma'amin, and I understand that somebody who's a Jew understands what I'm talking about and probably say, a lot of nonsense, that's fine. But it's not hate speech. But basically, it's interesting because there was one anti-Semitic Protestant pastor in America who picked this up. And he wrote this article, very anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and his bottom line was, he quoted me verbatim, and the bottom line he wrote was, you see, what he said? Therefore we are all Amalekites. Okay, that was his take on it. Anyway, that's by the by. The idea that I want to get across here is that when a person reaches for levels above of Hasidim, of precious, of setting aside things that he would rather do, or in two ways. We're going to see abstaining from that which is mutter, or going the extra mile, as I spoke about, for example, in davening, in things which are mitzvahs. This creates an energy which affects not just him and not just Klal Yisrael, or the four, like as we spoke about, the four species of the Arava, etc., Lulav, but it's something which carries all the way up and makes the whole world a better place, quite literally. Excuse me. So, now, okay, so to go on, as we spoke about before, precious is desirable, is expected, with the caveats that we said, that I think it was based on your question really, that Chazal are not going to make it obligatory because they're not going to oblige the entire community to do something which not everybody is capable of doing. But for those who can, they should and they ought to, and there'll be a taina against the person, I think, that if he didn't do what he could have done. And as we spoke about, how a person can find out for himself exactly where he should be applying his efforts and where he shouldn't be. Now, the undesirable type of separation. As we spoke about, there's a precious which is good. We spoke about that. The precious which is not good is, he says here quite literally, Ach ha-precious hara hu kederech hagoyim has cholim, the way of foolish Gentiles, who abstain not only from that which is inessential, but also from things that are essential. For example, I could think of like in India where people starve themselves, go on these fasts, people who sit on the top of mountains and eat grass, and people who do things which are afflicting the body in ways which are unnatural and unhealthy. This is a kind of precious which is foolish, not desired, and forbidden. As it says, Chazal say, Adarabba. It says, Osela Odom, Shesagev Atzmoi. It's forbidden for a person to torture himself, he says in the English. I wouldn't say torture, but to afflict himself unnecessary. I mean, of course, the Yom Kippur, it says that a person, we were supposed to afflict ourselves, but only at specific times and to a specific degree. The Torah forbids a person to get carried away in these, in these strange practices of abstinence and flagellation, for example, all of these things. And I would think, quite possibly, I'm not a psychologist, but I would think that somebody who has a tendency to this could actually get quite a lot of pleasure out of this. A person fasts to a certain extent. It can become like a high, but it's wrong. It's wrong. You're not allowed to do that. Another example, if for a person who won't take because of pride, they won't take tzedakah. Kol mi shetzorech litoil, anybody who needs to take tzedakah, ve'eino notel, and doesn't take, harei zeh shofech domim, he's spilling blood. A person has to understand that he's not allowed to starve himself rather than take tzedakah. The pasuk says in Tainus, lenefesh hachayo. Lenefesh hachayo. Sustain the soul that I gave you. Neshama shenasati b'cha hachayo. So that's the parish of the pasuk. The living soul, meaning the soul that I gave you, make it live. And Va'omer says in Tainus, Kol Yoshev b'Tainus nikra choita. Anybody who sits fasting, again, not of course the fasting that Chazal prescribed for us, the Diraisa fast of Yom Kippur, the fast of Tisha B'Av, Sarah B'Tevis, Shivaras Patamus, Tainus Esther, Tainus Choloim. If a person have a bad dream, could be he should fast. Tainus Baham, there are some people who do fast on Monday and Thursday and Monday after the Chagim. But apart from those fasts, just Stam, to sit and fast is, for most people anyway, and in most cases, an Issa. Kol Ayoshev B'Tainus Nikra Choita. And let's see one. Yeah. Of course, this is, he says here, he says that's talking to about a person who is in no condition to fast. Okay. I don't see the Mesilas Sham says that, but I accept that. And Hillel, it says about Hillel, Goimel nafsho ish chesed. Goimel, he who is Goimel, who is kind, nafsho, to his soul, ish chesed. He is called a man of kindness. Man of kindness. Mishlei, that's a pasuk in Mishlei. Now, Hillel applied that to somebody who ate his breakfast. Al achilas haboiker. V'hayarochetz ponov. V'yodov l'chvod koinoi. And a person, it's a halacha, he washed his face and his hands in honor of his maker. Because a person is created b'tzelem Elokim, in the image of his maker, an image of God, and therefore by washing his own face, he's, so to speak, honoring Hashem. And it says in Vayikra Rabbah, they learned this as a Kal Machoymer from Midyoknois HaMelochim, from the images of kings that there were these like statues of kings that they used to wash them down, wash their faces. So if we're going to wash a statue to be Mechabed the king, so for sure we should wash our face, a living person who is a duke, so to speak, B'Tselem Elokim, is in the image of God. Of course, that has to be understood what that means, but that's the source. Okay, so the truth is, the bottom line is that a person should separate himself from anything which is not essential to him. We discussed how you arrive at that conclusion, what's essential. When it comes to Olam Hazeh, this world. And on the other hand, if a person separates himself from anything which is essential to him, and essential could be physically essential, it could be emotionally essential. If he does that, he's called a choita. It's not just not advisable, that is a sinner. So it's a very clear sort of black and white case. If you can do it, you have to do it. And if you can't do it, you're not allowed to do it. It's also to do it. And that would be, he says, regardless of the reason, for whatever reason. Anyway, the point is here that this principle is consistent. It's across the board. But the individual application of it, of course, as we've given a couple of examples, will vary very much from individual to individual. And each one of us has to sit down and work out exactly in what areas it's possible. And again, we're talking about precious. It could be that we're just not shaykh to precious at all. There will be some of us who go, Rabbi, this is fine, thank you very much, I'd come. But if you feel that you couldn't do more, then you should do more. But again, you have to do more along the lines that you're drawn to, and making very sure that it doesn't take you to a place of dejection, depression, or rejection. What he says here, however, as we just said, is that basically it's impossible for him to list all of the areas where it's possible to separate oneself, to be poresh, to live on a higher, less physical level. They're so numerous that the mind can't encompass them, but a person has to deal with them, each one of them, each individual, in his own time and his own way. Okay, I think it's a good place for us to pause here. Mesilas Hashem, next week we'll go in with chapter Yud Daled, Perek Yud Daled, which is the divisions of precious. We spoke a little bit about that, but he's going to give us 3 specific categories. Okay, thank you very much.